murder of millions of his own citizens during his reign over the Soviet Union. It's widely known that he purged his military and government after taking power, intentionally starved Ukraine and Kazakhstan, sent scores of political dissidents to the infamous gulags, committed numerous massacres, and a whole lot more, all of which resulted in deaths in excess of 10 million people, with some historians estimating a staggering 20 million or higher. With numbers this extreme and decades of history to sift through, it was only inevitable that at least one of his atrocious acts would be largely swept under the rug, and that's exactly what happened to the Crimean Tatars. Officially called a deportation or a forced resettlement by the Soviet authorities and most other countries, the sickening death toll and irreparable damage it did to the Tatar homeland and culture makes it clear that only one label can describe what really went down, and that's genocide. Now, the history of the Crimean Tatars goes back deep into history. The people are indigenous to Crimea, but their history began to be shaped around the 13th century, when they became a state of the Golden Horde called the Crimean Khanate, under which the population converted to Islam. The Golden Horde splintered over time, but the Crimean Khanate held on and remained stable for hundreds more years. Its independence was lost, however, in 1783, when it was annexed by the Russian Empire, who they'd been at war with on many, many occasions. Over the next century or so, the empire began their tried-and-true process of Russification, which, at its least violent, basically involves flooding an area with their own Slavic people to marginalize natives, while also, either officially or unofficially, removing the target's native language and culture. Under Russian rule, scores of Crimeans began fleeing the peninsula, with around 300,000 departing for the Ottoman Empire in just the first few years after annexation. Even more fled their homeland in the mid-1800s after Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, which was fought against the Ottomans, British and French. Despite the name of the war, the defeat didn't result in any territorial changes in Crimea itself, but it did result in further Russian scrutiny over their ethnic minorities, an attitude which only got worse after the January Uprising, a rebellion in Poland led by Polish, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian rebels. After the uprising had been dealt with, Tsar Alexander II boosted Russification policies as an attempt to further reduce internal conflicts. After all, if all these other minorities lost their original cultures, they wouldn't even know they were under colonial rule. These new policies included restricting local languages, often reducing them to optional school subjects, while the main courses were all taught in Russian, and the banning of local traditions and replacing them with Russian ones. Throughout these new policies, more and more Tatars left Crimea, along with hundreds of thousands of other Muslims throughout the Russian Empire, and by the year 1900, Crimean Tatars were no longer the ethnic majority in their region. In just 100 years, they'd gone from comprising 98% of the peninsula's population to just 34%, with the region now dominated by Slavic people. But things were about to get a whole lot worse. 1917 saw the formation of the USSR, and Crimea was granted the status of an autonomous region called the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, this sounds nice and fairly independent on paper, but in reality, the new republic was soon to be horribly mistreated. For starters, tens of thousands of people were executed here during the Red Terror, accused of being enemies of the state. Then, collectivization in the 1920s saw the Soviet government redistribute crops to other republics that they deemed more important, leading to a severe famine in Crimea that killed around 100,000 people, at least 3/4 of which were Tatars. After Stalin rose to power, the situation deteriorated even further as his policies continued to starve poor regions of the Soviet Union and to heavily suppress local culture. In 1941, Germany invaded and annexed much of the western USSR, including Crimea. Crimean Tatars that had been captured while serving in the Red Army were sent to prisoner of war camps and labeled Mongol subhumanity and Asiatic inferiors, which, of course, Germany intended to exterminate. During the occupation of Crimea, many Tatars formed partisan groups, disrupting supply lines and fighting a guerrilla war while they awaited the return of the Red Army. However, as with all occupied territories, there were also collaborators who aided the Nazis and were permitted to form official Muslim committees that monitored the local population. The other Tatars that aided the Axis were from POW camps who had been recruited to fight against the Soviets when it became clear that the tide in the war was shifting. In 1944, the Red Army finally liberated Crimea, and by then 130,000 lives had been lost during the occupation, along with the complete annihilation of 70 villages. As the Germans retreated, their fascist collaborators and committees fled with them, evacuating to Germany and Hungary, where they joined the Wehrmacht's Turkestan division. This was widely known, and several Soviet officials at the time recognized that the Crimean Tatars had not betrayed the USSR en masse, and that the collaborators were but a minority. To further prove the point, more than 25,000 Tartars served honorably in the Red Army throughout the entire war, all the way up to the Battle of Berlin. In fact, after the war, several thousand of them received high honors in the army for actions of bravery and courage, including 6 who received the highest possible distinction of Hero of the Soviet Union. But all of this would soon be twisted. You see, Stalin was highly suspicious of Crimean Tatars, and some of them collaborating with Germany was all the ammunition that he needed to make a move on them. After the war, 10 ethnic minority groups were collectively punished for alleged collaboration, including Tatars, despite their frantic denial of any wrongdoing. A clear example of which can be seen in their reporting of Uzir Abdurrahmanov. Uzir was a sapper in the Red Army and was assigned, along with 16 others, to build a bridge across the icy Soj River. After staying in the ice water for 9 straight hours under heavy enemy fire, only 9 of the sappers survived, but they completed their task and their troops were able to safely cross the river. Uzir sustained a serious head injury, blood loss, and hypothermia during the operation, but he survived and was declared a hero of the Soviet Union for his determination. But these selfless actions didn't fit the narrative that Tatars had all been a traitorous bunch. And so the media lied, and they said that he was actually from Azerbaijan. Another war hero, Bekir Osmanov, who had been an influential Soviet partisan for several years, was falsely depicted in several places as a German spy who had been shot for treason during the war, even though in reality he lived until the 1980s. But this misinformation campaign was just the beginning, a tactic to turn the public opinion against the natives of Crimea so that Stalin could initiate the next step of his terror. Now, the idea of deporting Crimeans first arose in 1944, suggested to Stalin by Lavrentiy Beria, who, by the way, would later be found guilty of treason, terrorism, and serial rape, just in case you needed more evidence of how downright evil he was. The supposed point of relocating certain ethnicities was that they couldn't be trusted to populate the border regions of the USSR, where they could be easily swayed by nearby foreign powers. And so, on May the 11th, 1944, Stalin issued GKO Order Number 5859SS, a document outlining a plan to deport Crimean Tatars out of their homeland. The order began by stating the accusations laid against the Tatars, such as, during the Patriotic War, many Crimean Tatars betrayed their motherland, deserted from the Red Army, actively collaborated with the German occupation authorities, were especially distinguished by their brutal reprisals against Soviet partisans. Until eventually, the document reads, taking into account the above, all Tatars should be evicted from the territory of Crimea and settled permanently as special settlers in the regions of the Uzbek SSR, without any input from the Crimeans themselves. Without any due process or legal routine, it was decided that they needed to leave their homes and live in Uzbekistan, more than 3,000 kilometers, 2,000 miles away. The deportation began on May the 18th and lasted just 3 days. Agents of the NKVD secret police systematically moved from house to house, forcing Tatars at gunpoint to gather a bag of belongings and enter sealed-off cattle trains that would be taking them to the most remote parts of Uzbekistan. Anyone who resisted was executed. The only way to avoid this collective punishment was to be a Tatar woman married to a man of Slavic descent. Otherwise, it didn't matter who you were or what you'd done, you were leaving. Even Uzir Abdurrahmanov, who, as we just mentioned, was a literal war hero who had risked his life for his fellow countrymen, was instantly expelled from the Moscow Engineering School and shipped away. It would be an understatement to say that the train ride across the USSR was brutal. The crowded wagons lacked almost any food and water. Officially, there were supposed to be 50 occupants per wagon, but this guideline was rarely followed to save space. One witness claimed there were 133 people in her wagon. There was only a single hole in the floor to use as a toilet, 0 fresh air since the doors had been bolted shut, and typhus quickly began spreading. Worst of all, many pregnant women were forced to give birth in these horrible conditions. The train ride lasted for at least 2 weeks, with some trips taking up to 24 straight days. And in the end, the official NKVD record shows that 7,889 Tatars died en route to Central Asia. 151,000 Crimean Tatars ended up in Uzbekistan, 4,000 in Kazakhstan, and around 35,000 in various remote regions of Siberia. Along with them, the NKVD also evicted nearly 10,000 Armenians, 12,000 Bulgarians, and 15,000 Greeks. On the 4th of July, 1944, the NKVD sent an official report to Stalin that the deportation was complete and that resettlement was underway. However, not long after sending off this report, they realized that they'd forgotten to work through a region called the Arabid Arrow, where several hundred Crimean Tatars were still living in small coastal villages. The NKVD didn't want to organize another train route for them because word of it could easily spread and make it appear that they had lied when they reported that the order had been complete. And so they decided on an easier way to clean out the villages. On July the 20th, hundreds of Tatars were corralled onto an old boat, which was then taken out into the middle of the Azov Sea and sunk. Anyone who didn't drown in the aftermath was finished off by the NKVD, who were waiting on the shores with machine guns. Now that the peninsula had been ethnically cleansed, Stalin authorized the emigration of 51,000 people, mostly Russians and Ukrainians, into Crimea to settle the farms they'd confiscated. In total, the government seized 80,000 houses, 500,000 cattle, 360,000 acres of land, and 40,000 tons of agricultural provisions. Then the Crimean ASSR was dissolved, but simply their home was gone. Not only had they been forced to relocate to a remote region of Uzbekistan, they also were immediately subject to living conditions that can only be described as truly horrific. Upon arrival, the local Uzbeks threw rocks at the Crimeans and called them fascist collaborators. This treatment was perhaps made worse by Soviet propaganda, which claimed that they had voluntarily resettled and the Uzbeks didn't appreciate their lands being taken by people they'd all been told were traitors. Over the coming years, several Crimean Tatars would be killed in Uzbek attacks, to which the government turned a blind eye. The first 5 years of this resettlement were the most brutal. Diseases spread like wildfire, malnutrition and injuries claimed lives, and deserters were executed. The official Soviet records showed that 44,887 excess deaths in the first 5 years of resettlement. Later, when Crimean Tatar activists began releasing statistics showing that 46 of people living in exile had died from disease or labor, which the government labeled as slander to the USSR, and in order to prove them wrong, published their own stats showing that only 22% of the ethnic group had been entirely wiped out. Various other mortality rates for these first few years have been thrown around, ranging from around 34,000 all the way up to 80,000. Regardless of the death toll, life in exile was made as harsh as it could be. Most deportees ended up in forced labor, working in coal mines and construction teams, working brutal schedules of 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Despite this strenuous work, many were only allotted between 200 and 400 grams of bread per day, and even once they were off work, their new homes would be anything but relaxing, as the accommodations were extremely lacking, with many describing their houses as huts with no doors or windows and just reeds to sleep on the floor. One woman recalled, "My parents had sisters and brothers, but when they arrived in Uzbekistan, the only survivors were themselves. My parents, sisters, and brothers, and parents all died in transit because of catching bad colds and other diseases. My mother was left completely alone, and her first work was to cut trees." Crimean Tatars were denied the right to education and could not publish works in their native language. Officially registered as special settlers, Tatars were officially considered second-class citizens and were not allowed to leave the borders of the region they'd been assigned to, essentially making it an open-air prison. Things looked like they were about to improve in the 1950s, though, when Stalin died and Nikita Khrushchev took power. Khrushchev held a speech at one point condemning many of Stalin's actions, including the mass deportation of certain ethnicities, and authorized several groups to return to their homes. However, 3 were forced to remain in exile: Soviet Germans, Meskhetian Turks, and Crimean Tatars, even when Crimea was officially added to the Ukrainian Republic. Census reports over the next few decades would only allow the people to classify themselves as Tatar, carefully eliminating Crimean from the name. Even in 1967, when Soviet officials issued a decree dropping the mass charge of treason against the ethnicity, they were careful to word their name not as Crimean Tatar, but rather citizens of the Tatar nationality who, having formerly lived in Crimea, have now taken root in the Uzbek SSR. And although the treason charges have been dropped, they were still barred from returning home. In 1968, 6,000 formed their own group and headed home, only to be deported for a second time, and the most iconic moments of the Crimean struggle was captured by a man named Musa Mahmut. Mahmut had been deported when he was 12 and suffered in forced labor for 35 years. Upon sneakily returning to Crimea, he was apprehended and he was told he would be deported. Instead, he set himself on fire, displaying to the world that death was preferable to the conditions that he would face in exile. The travel ban wouldn't be lifted until the late 1980s, when a huge Tatar protest near the Kremlin forced Gorbachev's hands in officially removing conditions placed on deported ethnicities. And that same year, 166,000 Tatars would make their way home, finally freed, after more than 40 years. In 1991, the USSR made its greatest contribution to the world by collapsing into its constituent, now independent republics. Crimea became part of Ukraine, and nearly all of the returnees were instantly granted Ukrainian citizenship under the new laws. However, they still faced a lot of issues. Rebuilding their communities proved to be difficult as nearly all the land had now been inhabited by other families for nearly 40 years. The way the government of Ukraine operated with the peninsula was by mostly just letting Crimea govern itself. It was renamed the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and wrote its own constitution of Crimea, which was approved by Kiev. Throughout the early 2000s, Crimean Tatars made up around 12% of the population there. The victory for sure, but once again, trouble was heading their way. In 2014, Crimea was annexed by the Russian Federation, marking the beginning of the ongoing conflict with Ukraine and a new beginning of struggle for the Tatar people. More than 10,000 of them fled immediately after the annexation, but those who stayed would be subject to what the UN continues to classify as human rights violations. These include intimidation by Russian authorities to vote or identify in certain ways, imprisoning Crimean Tatar officials on dubious charges, and banning their highest representative councils. In 2015, it was reported that Russia had banned the public remembrance of the deportation and events that had occurred annually up to that point. It really seems that there is just no end in sight for the struggles of the Tatars. According to many modern historians, such as British scholar Walter Kollars, the deportation was simply Stalin's excuse to complete a centuries-long colonization of Crimea, pushing its people away in order to seize the prime land. Of course, this effort can be seen as being undone in an instant when the USSR collapsed, since Crimea was left with Ukraine, leading to Putin's desire to reclaim it. Currently, only 4 countries on Earth recognize the events that unfolded as a genocide, those being Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and Canada. Others, mostly Russia, largely dispute the events, such as Alexander Statiev, who claims that although the death toll was certainly high, Stalin had no intent of exterminating the people. But taking into consideration the destruction of their homelands, the false accusations levied against their entire nation, the collective punishments, death, and hardship brought to them based purely on their ethnicity, it's clear that they were, and to some extent still are, victims of ethnic cleansing. And it's really quite a miracle that they've managed to maintain their cultural and linguistic identity.
Cool. Now we're going to be joined by one of my students, Kimberly. And Kimberly, could you tell us a little bit about what you would like to see as a more engaging way of learning when you're learning history or geography?
Well, I want to learn more about like what happened in the past and like to see if patterns could happen and just, be more educated on everything that has happened in the world. Because even if I'm not the one living in it and didn't live through that past, like that time, it still matters to me and it still affects me like on every day. Okay, now with that in mind, when you just learn dates and you learn things that are not really connected, can you get patterns real simply? Well, I think you can. But would it be easier if it was formatted in a way that you could actually see patterns before without having to put them together yourself? Oh yeah, definitely would be easier, yeah. Okay, now we're talking about genocide. We have this project, genocide, and today we're talking about the Tatar Genocide of starting on May 18th of 1944, where 240,000 Tatars were exported to different parts of Russia and Uzbekistan and some other areas. What do you think about the concept of somebody coming into a country and taking over and just forcing people off the land? What do you think's wrong with that? It's unfair. Okay. It's uncruel. It's like unhumanized. Okay. Now, also, I know that you are pretty well familiar with some countries in Central America. And in those areas where they had the unstable government, a lot of people have left that country and gone to other countries. What's the difference between you personally choosing to leave a country and then being forced to leave a country? Well, again, it's mainly the big scenario of your choice and not being your choice. My family decided to leave where we used to live to move forward and get better education for future generations of our family. We decided to do that for our family. We weren't forced out, and being forced out is just different because, you're getting forced out. It's as simple as that. You're getting forced out. You're not leaving because you want to leave. You're happy with your life there and you're being forced to get rid of it and to start somewhere else. Okay, and America's always been very accepting of immigrants normally. My families were immigrants. People, families are immigrants. What has changed in the United States, do you think, that has made all of a sudden people be more anti-immigrant than they've been for a long time? Well, I think like anti-immigrant, well, they don't accept it as much anymore. Well, I think I think it's just also a lot about how you raise your kids and what you raise them to believe. So I feel like a lot of people are getting raised to believe that they're a different type of people and that they're bad, whenever necessarily that isn't true. I think a lot of the choices that presidents have made in the past few years also have affected that a lot, and just, basic stereotypical.
Okay, now you brought up a real good point that we've been talking about for the last 5 or 6 months. It's basically called edgicide, where the government or somebody will come out with a certain narrative and they try to teach this narrative. And the narrative could be that immigrants are taking people's jobs or something like that. But, as I know that your mother is an entrepreneur, she's starting her own business. Literally speaking, she's helping out the American economy. So there are people that come to our country or to your country and actually become better citizens than some people who are
Yeah.
citizens.
I think a lot of people believe that immigrants are taking jobs because one, immigrants when in other places they don't come from much, so it's like they're not expecting a lot, they're just expecting enough to live. So when they come to the US, they accept kind of more of the bare minimum, unlike Americans who have been here for a while and know that they can get more and more and they want more. Therefore, companies prefer immigrants that they can lowball instead of people who they have to pay high amounts.
Okay, now we're gonna talk a little bit about the history or the movement of the Tatars to the Crimea. Originally, the Tatars came from an area that would be in the steppes or between what today is the USS, well, excuse me, Russia and Mongolia and China, and they moved westward towards the areas of which you would see in the Crimea. Now, the interesting part about this is as everybody moved west or as they shaped that, and they become basically not indigenous, but they are native to that population. So when they decide to, in one day or 3 days, decide to take all the people from one area and move them by rail car, force them out of their own property and not paying them any money for that, what would you call that?
Like,
Would you call that a genocide if all of a sudden you were forced out of your house and okay, you had to move to parts unknown and you wouldn't give any money for
yeah, pretty much, yeah.
yeah. So and this is what even as we're discussing this today, probably 95% of the American high school students do not know what actually took place. So this is important to understand. This is important to teach. We do not want to have a second-class education. There are people who are actually coming to America to get a first-class education. And when they find out that how deplorable sometimes the way we teach some of our subjects, we're not giving them a first-class education. We're just continuing a narrative that things aren't that important. If you only have one paragraph to they will say that the war between the North and South was fought for civil rights, not civil rights, but were fought for slavery. That may not necessarily be the case from that, but you'll see one paragraph in almost every American history textbook that will say that. So a lot of the stuff, even in Remember the Maine, when they blew up the Maine ship in Havana Harbor, it was very incredulous to think that it was probably blown up by Cubans or Spanish. And in the Gulf of Tonkin, we actually create a incident in which we try to start a foaming war. So you have examples all throughout this. I could bring back to one that took place this last fall in Okhtosh. They were saying it was a breakaway rebel enclave of Armenian people living in the mid-center of a country. And that was not necessarily what the real narrative is. So today we are about to show you the history of the Tatars. I want you to look at that. And then when we come back after that, we'll ask you a few questions.
Hey, we're going to be having a look at Little Tartary, the lesser known Tartary, European Tartary, many names. But we're going to be discussing that, having a look at what the older documents have to say. We're going to be comparing that to what Wikipedia has to say. We're not going to be diving too deep because I want to cover as many of these books as I can. The history of Little Tartary, just like any country, is vast. So if you want to learn the entire thing, you're probably going to have to break out some books for yourself. But unfortunately, they do try and disguise these things under different histories, make it seem like it was not connected into a vaster system, which of course you can do with anything. So we're going to start by having a look at what Wikipedia has to say generally about Tartary. Tartary or Tatary, the Tatar coming from the extra R added at some point in our history, or Tatar as in Tatarstan. Tartary was a blanket term used in Western European literature and cartography for a vast part of Asia, bounded by the Caspian Sea, the Ural Mountains, the Pacific Ocean, and the northern borders of China, India, and Persia, at a time when this region was largely unknown to European geographers. So the general sentiment of that paragraph is just uneducated Westerners called the whole area Tartary. The active use of the name could be traced from the 13th century to the 19th century. In European sources, Tartary became the most common name for Central Asia that had no connection with real politics or ethnic groups of the region. Until the 19th century, European knowledge of the area remained extremely scarce and fragmentary. The region formerly known as Tartary is usually called Inner or Central Eurasia. Much of this area consists of arid plains, the main nomadic population of which in the past was engaged in animal husbandry. And then obviously it goes on to talk about the conspiracy theories of Tartary. So the general theme of what Wikipedia wants you to believe is that Tartary was just a general term for this vast section of land for uneducated Westerners that didn't have any ideas of the real history of the areas. We can argue about that, which we will do. But the other thing that they're trying to put in is that much of the area is just nomadic people that were farmers, essentially. Whereas the idea that they'd entered the Iron Age 700 to 900 years before the rest of the world, that would make their technology around 700 to 900 years more advanced. So in that aspect, they would have been a very advanced nation. And as we saw in the last video, the one about the pole shifts, we saw that Lake Baikal has shown evidence of exactly that. And Lake Baikal is in the heart of Tartary. Knowledge of Manchuria, Siberia, and Central Asia in Europe prior to the 18th century was limited. The 18th century is the 1700s. The entire area was known simply as Tartary, and its inhabitants, Tatars. That is inaccurate. As you'll see through reading many of these books, the people are referred to as a multitude of different names. They're never referred to as just Tatars. And the idea of this is to make it seem like Western Europeans had no clue about the area of land and then just racistly painted everyone as the same. How many people would refer to North America as Americans? And North America is massive, okay? Then you've got Canada. So you say, okay, you're Canadians because you're on this side of the line. But these guys, they're Americans. But they're not, really. Each state in America is bigger than most countries. By that logic, calling everybody in America an American is just as uneducated as calling everybody in Tartary a Tartarian. Do you understand where I'm coming from? So this is how they've tried to paint it. This is how they've tried to trick. Just because they were referred to as Tatars doesn't mean that we had no knowledge of them. It just means that they all came from this one unified place. There's people that will refer to everyone from Europe as Europeans. There is a European Union, so you'd every right to refer to them as Europeans. If people from the European Union came to visit you, you'd call them Europeans. To say, oh, we had no knowledge of this thing. We just called them Tatars. It was just a vast country called Tartary. That's incorrect. These people might have been connected to this vaster place. As they'll go on to discuss, there are many different smaller versions of Tartary. And yes, in the bigger kingdom of Tartary, there were smaller vassal kingdoms that all joined together. And yes, they had wars, they had infighting, just like everywhere else. America has had civil wars, and one of them won, and now owns all of America. That's essentially what it was like in Grand Tartary. You talk about Genghis Khan, who unified the nations. Yes, he did exactly that. He won. And he took over all the places and he unified them and said, right, we're one big country now. And then it falls to pieces, then somebody unifies it again, etc., etc. It's literally like the history of any other country. But they try and twist it to make it sound like nonsense. In the early modern period, as understanding of geography increased, Europeans began to subdivide Tartary into sections with prefixes denoting the name of the ruling power or the geographical location. Once again, this is normal. They subdivide Tartary into sections with prefixes denoting the name of the power or geographical location. So they're making it sound like it's a bad thing to subdivide areas based on geographical location. Once again, North America, South America. Oops, I just subdivided America into two things based on geographical location. The United States of America that are subdivided into states of Tennessee, Texas, Alabama, California. I'm not going to go through every state. You've got places like Virginia. Now there's a West Virginia. There's Dakota, North and South Dakota. It's nonsense. And especially by ruling power, that makes sense. It's a very normal thing to call something based on the ruling power. Example, I'll give you here.
Universal Technical Institute is making more than $15 million in scholarship.
There's a good example, British India. The British were in India, they called it British India because it was British-owned India. It's very simple, it's a normal thing to happen. As a result, Siberia was Great Tartary or Russian Tartary. The Crimean Khanate was Little Tartary. Manchuria was Chinese Tartary. And Western Central Asia, prior to becoming Russian Central Asia, was known as Independent Tartary. By the 17th century, however, largely under the influence of Catholic missionary writings, the word Tatar came to refer to the Manchus and the lands they ruled as Tartary. Manchus are in the area of North China, which is Cathay, an entirely different conspiracy we've got to get into and explain, which we will do, but not today because we're going into Little Tartary. The Crimean Khanate was Little Tartary, which is what we're focusing on. Manchuria was Chinese Tartary, which was known as Cathay, which they'll try and tell you was always just China and was confused with China, but we won't go into that. We're also going to examine the Crimean Khanate, which is mentioned here, because that is a big part of it. And also this, the Western Central Asia as independent Tartary. We've talked about this a lot in my Tartaria in the News series, where we viewed all the articles from the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, etc., which were talking all about the Russian invasion of these different places in independent Tartary, starting with Bukhara, Kokand, Khiva. Eventually, they had the whole thing. If you want to learn about that, go watch that entire series. It is a long series, but there is the full video that you can watch. First map that we're going to have a peek at with some text to talk about is from John Speed from 1626. And this is a map of Russia. You can see here what Moscow looked like, which is just incredible. If you want to have a pause and have a look at some of these places, because that's the key there. And these are all the letters, obviously. You can see how detailed this is. Did a very good job of drawing that, didn't he? Notice the double eagle up here. So that's Moscow up there. And down here is Crimea or Tartary Prekopensian, which is something that's going to come up in the other document that we've got, which I'll show you. So the other document is going to be this, a little description of the Great World, augmented and revised by Peter Halen. And it was supposedly printed in 1625. I know that we've got a copy here, which is the one we're going to be used to read because it's a bit easier, which I pulled from this website, turned into a little PDF, talking about Tartary. So it's obviously page 659. I'm not sure if this contains the entire book. This is supposedly the text from it. I know that at some point in this, it mentions Anno 1844. So it was definitely revised after 1844 for it to have mention of that. I'm not sure if that's in the original book, because if that's in this book, then that means that this has come out after 1850, which might make a bit more sense because it does look quite good condition for something that's supposedly come out in 1625. Then we've also got more to talk about from 1680. and one more from 1721 that we'll talk about as well. So we'll focus on these now. Now, one of the most interesting things about our 1626 John Speed map of Russia, as you will see, is that it seems to suggest that this entire area here is under control of Crimean Tartary, which might even extend down to Caucasia. And these guys, at one point, were probably considered the most important Tatars. These were the ones that actually ruled Moscow. These guys were actually in control of Moscow for quite some many years before they were overthrown by the Muscovites. But something interesting is what appears to be a system going all the way around Little Tartary. So your entire access point to Asia from this section has got a wall here. And you'll notice it goes from river to river. Obviously, rivers are acting as a natural barrier. Coming in, we can see that it's definitely drawn as if to be a mountain or hill mounds, or possibly a dike. And it's also got these towers, which would insinuate these are checkpoints or places for you to possibly get through, places for you to pay your taxes. So that's very interesting because you can't find anything about a giant wall being constructed from the Volga, all the way to the Dnieper. It's quite crazy. Coming to the page which talks about Tartary, page 40, we have found Tartaria Minor is called likewise Horda Pracapensium. Now, Horda, the horde, is just a word for the army. It's actually where our English word for order probably comes from. And order, armies have order. So yes, that's actually is the armies really. The Russians, their armies were literally called orders. So lots of people, particularly Fomenko, suggested that that's insinuates that the Russians were the ones that had this empire, and obviously considering Tartary is Russia, I suppose that's not too far from the truth. But Order Pracapensium, a force of Tatars which have their name from one city, Prekops, but inhabit all of those plains which lie round about the Pontus Exinus, or Mare Magor, and Palus Meotis, including the whole Taurica Chersonesus, so that she extends her limits from the banks of the river Borysthenes as far as Tanne. Her chief province is the Chersonesus, a peninsula 70 miles in compass, which took the name of Taurica from Osiris. That's very interesting. Osiris, of course, being the Egyptian. It was invaded by one Ulanus, from whom the inhabitants of this whole region were sometimes called Ulani. Oh, that's strange, isn't it? I thought that everybody just called them Tatars in the 1600s. But this guy's calling them Ulani, as they were after Crim Tatars, from that city, Crim, once the king's seat of this peninsula, though it stood not within her limits, for her principal town was Theodosia, now Kassa, where there was heretofore a colony of Genoese, till they were dispossessed by Muhammad, the 8th emperor of the Turks. The other towns of this Tartaria Pracapensis, which stand without the Chersonesus, are Okazan, which the people took from the dukes of Lithuania and Tanas, which stands in the utmost part of this Tartaria, above the mouth of the river Tanal, some 3 miles distant. It is called by the inhabitants Azak, and is a place of great traffic and free access for many neighboring nations. I can never ignore Magog, which is over here talking about Tartaria Antiqua, which is something that's going to come up a lot. Chinchis, which is obviously Genghis, and his Tatars taking over that land. So if you haven't seen our Magog video, you'll see that, because that'll give you some information. Oh, it also talks about the kingdom of Tabor. This is really interesting because the kingdom of Tabor supposedly had a king in 1540 who was Jewish, who went to Europe, and he was burnt at the stake in Mantua by Charles V. But just wanted to bring that up because it's very interesting. I'm trying to find Tabor, but we can't. talks about Ani and Argan, Tenduk and Mongol. If you haven't seen videos to talk about Tenduk, go and watch the Gog and Magog and the Bargu video. Now come to our 1680 book, which talks about Tatar. This one is Robert Morden, I believe. Yep, Robert Morden. Actually talks about Tartaria in Europe, yeah, by Robert Morden. So here is the map. If you want to see it a bit longer, make sure to pause. Here is the Dnieper, and here is the Don and Tanai.
Recently, and for no reason at all, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, what the fuck are you talking about, you insane Hollywood? Do you know how big their legal department is, Face? So to recap, Mint is actually lowering prices on every plan to just $15 a month. And I will stay the hell out of the legal department.
If we just come back to the 1626 maps to get an idea of where we're looking at. So does that indicate that over 100 years, Lesser Tartary has shrunk down? Because obviously this is going all the way over here. Would imply some of these areas must be part of it. So it comes to 1680. So this one's only 60 years, or not 100. Next one will be 100 years. But 60 years have gone by. And this is what it's saying Tartaria in Europe is. We can see Moscovia up here. So 1680, assuming this is the boundary. We see the Nogoi Tatars over there, sometimes called the Noyan Tatars, because they'd be annoying those Russians. What's cool is we see the city called Canberra, which is quite interesting. We see a lot of Cams in Britain, like Cambria, Cambridgeshire, Camelot. There are loads. When it comes to Tatars, the insinuation can be that it comes from Sham or Khan, Sham and Khan being the ruler of the area. So that might literally be where the Sham lives. But you'd assume you'd be here in Krim, which we can have a look at today. We're going to actually have a peek at 4 of the cities that have been mentioned. This one down here, Kassa, we're going to have a look at that. And we're also going to have a look at Krim, Prekop, and Okazao. So this today is obviously modern day Ukraine, or this bit. This bit is at war right now. These are the areas that have been occupied by Russia, and obviously Crimea as well. Notice as well, up here we have Ungul, and we know that Ung means Gog, like Gog and Magog. The Lesser Tartary, which lies in Europe, is so called to distinguish it from the Grand, which makes part of Asia. It is also called Percopensis and Krim from the names of the principal cities, situated in the peninsula formerly called Taurika Chersonesus. Just as an example, by the way, of them using Sham, this is from a document on the National Library of Scotland. We could probably talk about this as well at some point. There's so much for us to discuss, and I don't want to bore you guys because I don't know how many of you just want to listen to me read entire documents, because to me that would seem boring, just listening to someone do that. I just really don't want to ruin it for you guys. You know, history, learning should be fun. But this is an example, so it's the character of Sultan Galga, the present Sham of Tartary. We're not going to be reading it. It's just an example of them using Sham, which is essentially like a prince or king. It can even be an emperor. They do use the word emperor as well. It's definitely related directly to the word Khan, though you can see how Khanate is a Shamit. So a Khan of a Khanate. You also have caliphs from caliphates, sultans from sultanates. I just thought I'd bring you to this Encyclopedia Britannica from 1797. You ask for a quick look at what this has to say. Tartan, in sea language, a small coasting vessel navigated in the Mediterranean Sea and having only one mast and a bowsprit. The principal sail, which is extremely large, being extended by a lateen yard. Why would a specifically Mediterranean boat be called a tartan boat? Unless, of course, the Tatars used that specific boat in the Mediterranean. We know the Tatars are most likely the Barbar coast, the barbarians from the Barbary coast. That's a cool connection. Also, here under Tartary, And bearing in mind, this is 1797. So Wikipedia says, you know, by the 18th, 19th century, people were starting to get information about the area and not use these terms. But bearing in mind, it literally does describe that it's bounded on the north by Siberia, or the part of Asia which belongs to Russia. It's bounded on the west by the rivers Don, Volga, and Kama, which separates it from Russia. It's bounded on the south by the Euxine and Caspian Seas, Karazm, the two Bacarias, that's Karazm, as in independent Tartary, the two Bacarias, I thought we talked about Baccaria and Kokand, Khiva from independent Tartary, China and Korea, and on the east by the Oriental or Tartarian Ocean. So what would that tell us? Let's have a quick look at the map. So we're just going to quickly try and work out exactly where it's saying Tartaria is, where it's telling us in 1797 the country of Tartary was, okay, which was divided into East and West Tartary. It said that it was bounded on the north by Russian Siberia. But we don't know exactly where that is, okay, so we'll put a little pin here. Okay, we can work out that this is the Khanate of Bukhara. So when it said the two Bukharas on the south, China, Korea, and on the east is the ocean. Okay, so it's bounded on its south by China and Korea. So we've just added on just a little marker, China, south for China, and there's for Korea. The reason we're saying China's here is because looking at this 1682 map, which shows Tartary here, and you can quite clearly see that Korea here and the Great Wall of China here, and that essentially is the border. We do know that the Wall of China was literally built to defend against the Tatars, because this map literally tells us a wall of 400 leagues built between the
Okay, what did we learn from that, Kimberly?
Well-
What'd you gain?
I saw a lot of the maps and got a lot of information about the comparison to the
Mhm.
United States and over there. That was maybe like the biggest thing for me that I think I like.
Okay, now, most of the stuff we saw, you had the double F for S, you know, in old English, or we call it looking at. But why study maps, and why are maps important, especially when it comes to combining maps and history? Why is it good to know where people came from and where they're going?
Well, because it is our world, no matter what it is, you have to know the world, you have to at least understand it. And it's important to learn how to at least understand and read a map.
Okay, now go back to what you originally said a while back about patterns. Do
Mhm.
maps help you understand patterns more of where people went and lived and stuff like that?
I think so, yeah. I mean, overall maps are the same, just in different formats and the different structures of it. But overall, it has the same aspects of it.
At the very beginning of this video, the gentleman that was narrating it explained that, you know, there was a real Western bias. In other words, Western Europeans will take their history a lot more serious than this. How does that show up with the Tatars? You know, we never heard of this group of people. They 240,000 were, you know, involved in a genocide with Stalin. But yet it looks like they control the vast amounts of area. What was surprising about that to you?
I think just like, oh, it's just surprising how it all works, and like again, like how it's like it's so similar but so like the same at the same time. Like it's weird to explain it. It's just like it's so easy to understand, but so difficult to just like look at.
Mhm.
But it's so easy to understand it once you actually get the hang of it.
Yeah, I know. So if somebody's teaching world history, or somebody's teaching, you know, even about World War II, if they start mentioning something like this, how would that, you know, somebody is seeking a pattern, how would that help you understand more what was going on at that time?
I think, well, I'm not exactly sure, honestly.
Okay, well, let me put it this way. Okay, why do you think Stalin ended up trying to take these people out and put them in different areas and steal their land and steal their property from them?
Well, because at the end of the day, everyone wants to gain something.
Right,
gain
and they
that.
had really good land. I mean,
Yeah.
they had rich agricultural land. They had a lot of money. They had some other things. So I guess envy, jealousy, or whatever you
Yeah.
want to say. It's a line a deal, but you don't see too many people in the middle of the desert try to grab property unless there's minerals or something there. So this was a very rich land, but we see that this was just part of what they originally had. At one time, they controlled much of what we would say present-day Russia was. And they went all the way at the very end there before it pulled out. They went all the way from the China Sea all the way to the European continent. So this is a large group of people with a strong history that we kind of forget all about simply because probably not teaching not teaching lengths that we should. And that's the biggest thing. I think it's number 10 on that one list that Lillian talked about, having professional development. That's why these are so essential. So we are going to take a small break here. And then when we come back, you're going to be looking at the work, the student books and the lesson plans and some videos that are included in that. So enjoy your break. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, now today we're going to look at some very fascinating video. And I strongly encourage you to start looking at these for critical thinking purposes. And it may open up a lot of eyes. We're going to see something that is not necessarily in the history or geography books, but make it exciting for a lot of the kids. So please pay attention. And then afterwards, we will talk, share with you the materials that we're going to have.
In the mid-1900s, deep within the archives of the American Central Intelligence Agency, known worldwide as the CIA, lay hidden a classified document which mentions a country whose name has become but a myth. The mere mention of Tartaria invites a kaleidoscope of perspectives. Some theorists suggest a civilization harnessing free energy, a secret guarded by the hands of power. A realm where ancient Tartarians harness boundless energy, concealed from the world for generations. Yet skepticism still echoes. Free energy from a lost civilization, a fantastical conspiracy, or a concealed truth. For some, Tartaria remains elusive, a phantom civilization absent from historical records. What if Tartaria transcends myth? Some propose it as the medieval name for the Mongol Empire, a reinterpretation that adds a new layer to our understanding of a bygone era, challenging the annals of history and accepted academia. However, one thing can be certain. Tartaria was clearly mentioned in this CIA document. This document, titled National Cultural Development Under Communism, was first published in June of 1957 and was immediately classified. It was approved for release on the 24th of August, 1999. It starts with a proclamation issued on the 7th of December 1917 by the Bolsheviks. It reads, Muslims of Russia, Tatars of the Volga and the Crimea, Kyrgyz and Sarts of Siberia and Turkestan, Turks and Tatars of Transcaucasia, Chechens and mountain peoples of the Caucasus, and all you whose mosques and prayer houses have been destroyed, whose beliefs and customs have been trampled upon by the Tsars and the oppressors of Russia. Henceforth, your beliefs and customs, your national and cultural institutions are forever free and inviolate. Organize your national life in complete freedom. This is your right. The Bolsheviks had realized that if their revolution was to be a complete success, and if they were to be able to consolidate their newly won power, the support of Russia's minority peoples, including the Muslims, was essential. As well as this, Lenin and Stalin promised equality and sovereignty of all nations of Russia, the right of nations to free self-determination, including the right to secede and form independent states, abolition of all national and national religious privileges and restrictions whatsoever, and freedom of development for the national minorities and ethnographic groups inhabiting the territory of Russia. Unfortunately, for the many peoples of Russia, they had no idea just how little the Bolshevik promises actually meant. This document further alludes to the many ways in which the communists then suppressed the Muslims and other minorities and minority religious groups within Russia. The history of the communists during the 40 years they have been in power in the Soviet Union shows that self-determination has not been the only subject on which they betrayed both their promises and their alleged doctrine. In the Muslim regions of Russia, Islam was the hearthstone around which the life of its devotees revolved, or rather did revolve, until the communists violated their promises and made it impossible for Muslims to perform their religious duties. As we've seen, the November 1917 proclamation promised Muslims that they would be free to continue in practice of their faith. A decree on the separation of church from state issued on the 5th of February 1918 declared in Article 3 that every citizen may profess any religion or none. In Article 5, that free practice of religious rights is guaranteed, and in Article 9, that citizens may teach and study religion privately. Once the communists had consolidated their power, they began to reveal their true nature, to violate their earlier promises, and to take repressive acts. Lands belonging to mosques were confiscated by a decree in 1918. Muslim religious brotherhoods were outlawed during the period 1921 to 1922, and a campaign was launched to ridicule Islam and to undermine the influence of the spiritual leaders of the Muslim people. In 1929, measures were enacted that made the active religious life of Islamic worshippers virtually impossible. Islamic leadership was eliminated by the arrest and deportation, if not liquidation, of almost all persons enjoying any religious status. Nearly all village and most city mosques were closed. Religious literature was suppressed through the changing of alphabets, the confiscation of existing religious texts, including the Quran, and the suppression of all publications of a religious nature, and anyone in a responsible position was dismissed if known to be a pious and practicing Muslim. Muslims were to be free to practice their beliefs and customs. That was the Bolshevik promise. In 1917, when the communists came to power, there were 7,000 mosques in European Russia alone, in addition to the unnumbered thousands in Muslim Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Transcaucasia, as well as the Crimea. But in 1942, the communists themselves admitted that there were then only 1,312 mosques in the whole of the Soviet Union. The others had been confiscated and converted into warehouses or stores, or otherwise desecrated or allowed to fall into ruin. In Tashkent, for example, where once 300 mosques graced the city before the communists came to power, there were only 20 left. Samarkand, which formerly had over 100 and was the seat of Tamerlane's Tartarian Empire, had only 17 left, of which only one was permitted to be used. Bukhara, an independent Tartarian city, which once boasted of 360 mosques, was also reduced to just one. Alma-Ata, a Muslim town for centuries and the capital of the Muslim Republic of Kazakhstan, had not left one single mosque, nor any to be found in large Muslim centers such as Krasnovodsk, Ashgabat, or Stalinabad. The fact was that the communists condemned and therefore prevented the publication of all Muslim literary works, except those few which extol the virtues of Russia and the Russians. The document then goes on to mention Tartaria. Or, let us take the matter of history, which along with religion, language, and literature, constitute the core of a people's cultural heritage. Here again, the communists have interfered in a shameless manner. For example, on the 9th of August 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, sitting in Moscow, issued a directive ordering the party's Tatar Provincial Committee to proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by individual writers and historians in dealing with Tatar history. In other words, Tatar history was to be rewritten, let us be frank, was to be falsified, in order to eliminate references to great Russian aggressions and to hide the facts of the real course of Tatar-Russian relations. And this was no isolated case. In every Muslim area within the USSR, historians, on orders of the Communist Party, have rewritten history to distort the facts so that the Russians appear always in a good light. Needless to say, histories which present the facts truthfully have been withdrawn and destroyed, so that the present and future generations of Muslims are forever denied the chance of learning the true facts of their nation's past. So in this document, the writer, discussing historical events, has expressed concern about the interference of communists, particularly the Communist Party in the USSR, in shaping the narrative of history. The writer cites a specific instance in 1944 when the Communist Party directed a revision of Tartarian history to eliminate references to Russian aggression, suggesting a deliberate falsification of historical facts. The writer contends that this manipulation of history extends beyond Tartaria to all Muslim areas within the USSR, with the intent to portray Russians favorably. Additionally, the writer notes that truthful historical accounts have been withdrawn and destroyed, preventing present and future generations of Muslims and Tatars alike from learning the genuine facts about their nation's past. It is also extremely important to note how vital such a document like this is to be naming Tartaria as a country in the 1950s. The speaker highlights a pattern of interference by the Communist Party and the Russians in shaping the historical narrative, particularly in Muslim and Tatar areas within the USSR. The directive to revise Tartarian history and eliminate references to Russian aggression suggests a deliberate effort to manipulate historical facts. The broader assertion is that this trend extends beyond Tartaria, with historians rewriting history to portray Russians in a positive manner. This document emphasizes the removal and destruction of truthful historical accounts, denying present and future generations the opportunity to learn the genuine facts about our world's history. As we reflect on these concerns, it raises questions about the impact of such historical manipulation on cultural heritage and the understanding of complex relationships between different communities. The deliberate alteration of historical narrative poses challenges to the pursuit of truth and the preservation of diverse cultural identities. This message underscores the importance of critical examination and preservation of authentic historical records to ensure a comprehensive understanding of the past for generations to come. So this book that we're going to be having a look at, A Most Complete Compendium of Geography, it was released by Lawrence Icard in 1691, this original from the British Library. So this book in itself contains a lot of information that you can find elsewhere. There are other documents that have exactly the same stuff. This is an example of that. From 1715, a new description of the world, delineating Europe, Africa, Asia, and America. And there's many more. So I just searched for one of the words, which is another word for Uzbek Zagatay. And you can find all these different books that have references to exactly the same geography stuff. So they've all copied from the same sources. They do have slight differences. So an example would be from this one. We'll see that it talks about the 85th degree. And if we come over to this book here, the one that we're going to be reading from, it says the 83rd and 180th degree, whereas the other one was 85th and 182nd, 85th and 182nd. Between the same latitude, 39th and 72nd. But we're going to be talking about this, so you can check these documents out for yourself, see what you think. But we're going to be going over this first document. Just going to be seeing what it's saying, having a look on the map where that would be. So, Tartary is the greatest country in the world, lying on the east of Russia and the north of Persia, India, and China. Situated between the 83rd and the 180th degree of longitude and between the 39th and 72nd degree of latitude, being in length from the borders of Astrakhan to the eastern parts of Cathay, about 4,000 miles, and the breadth from the southern parts of Moranara, which is Zagathay or Uzbek, to the most northern parts of Tartaria Deserta, which is essentially the name for Siberia, which is about 2,000 miles. This contains the ancient provinces of Scythia, Sake, Sogdania, and the greatest part of Sarmatia Asiatica, with a little of old Persia. It has remained unconquered under several governments until anno 1162. The Tatars, an obscure people, overran this country and elected a monarchy which still remains, but a good part of it has fallen away. So again, this document was written in 1690. So in 1690, the Tatars still have their monarchy in Tartary, but most of it has fallen away. So that makes sense because in our other videos, we've gone over the Russian or Muscovite conquest of the Tatar areas. The emperor is called the Great Sham of Tartary, who is also the famous country of China. So it's saying that the Tatars own China in 1691. That would make sense. We know the Tatars retook China in the 1600s, 1644. They officially became the rulers with the Qing dynasty. The Ming dynasty beforehand were having issues. There was a peasants' revolt in Beijing. And at that point, the Mings asked the kings or the Qings to come and assist them. And that's when the Qing dynasty moved in. So going back to the document, the emperor is called the Great Sham of Tartary, who has also the famous country of China. Some part of it is under the Russians, the rest under several independent princes. The imperial seat is at Shambalu, as it is supposed. So this is important because Shambalu, we're going to have a look as a lot of references to it being Peking, but it's not Peking, it's a different city. We'll see some references for that just to prove that point. But we've got other videos about this, but the official line is that Shambalu is Beijing or Peking. A quick Google search will show you that Kambalu is Kanbalik or Dadu of Wan, which was the winter capital of the Wan dynasty in now Beijing, the capital of China. You see Kambalu, an alternative form of Kambaluk, comes from Marco Polo's travels, but it's not just Marco Polo, there's other people that talk about it. Marco Polo is the one they like to reference the most, and he apparently visited Kanbalik, which in East Turkish means city of the Khan, which, as we saw, is supposedly Kanbalik in Beijing. We can easily disprove this one. All we have to do is have a look where Beijing is, and we can see Beijing right here is behind the Great Wall of China. So this is where Beijing is, and Beijing was apparently conquered by Kublai Khan, and he supposedly called it Kambaluk, which was its name forever afterwards. However, if we come to this book called The History of Tamerlane the Great, taken out of Alicent, the Emperor's Historian, so this is by his historian himself. This book was printed in 1679, seems to have been translated, original documents, probably around the 1600s. And Timur is from 1336 to 1405. So we can see from this book, just from the table of contents, some of the things that Tamerlane does. He has a war with the Muscovites, has a war against the King of China. But before he can have a war against the King of China, he is stopped by the revolt of Calix, a great lord of Tartary. So this is before he goes against the King of China. And here it talks on page 35. Calix had been with his army of 100,000 men before the great and proud city of Kambalu, the metropolis of the province of Kate. The inhabitants had opened their gates and received him with as much joy as if he had been their lawful sovereign. However, Tamerlane, who comes from Zagate or Chagate, which is to the west, he comes and he fights Calix and he takes Kambalu. And this book talks more about it. You can see 14 mentions of Kambalu. And this is before he invades China. So let's have a look at the invasion of China. And as soon as it begins, it says the provinces of Liaotum and of Pekin. Pekin, of course, is Beijing, which the Chinese had taken from the Tartarians, were the causes of that anger and displeasure, which they could not dissemble. So, of course, Pekin had been taken from them in the terms of Kublai Khan had taken it himself or built it himself as Kanbalik, not Kambalu. These are different places. He built Kanbalik, but the Chinese had taken it back with the Ming dynasty. And Tamerlane was trying to re-establish the Wan dynasty, the Tatars, which the Chinese had taken from the Tartarians, were the causes of that anger and displeasure, which they could not disassemble. They found themselves by this means, and by a prodigious wall of a vast length, built in the passage of the mountains, deprived of the benefit of that prey which they were wont to make in that kingdom by their frequent inroads. So it's talking about the Great Wall of China, Pekin, Beijing in the Great Wall of China. So a simple deduction. How did Tamerlane manage to capture Kambaluk or Kambalu from Calix to then move south across the wall to then capture Kambalu again? If it's Pekin, if it's Beijing. If this is right, if the claims that Wikipedia made or the official narrative makes, an example is here. You can see that from the travels of Marco Polo on this Khan Academy, when they quote this point, in this city of Kambalu, another spelling for Kanbalik. You'll find this in all the old books as well. not the originals, obviously, but in the more recent translations, it'll say down below, Kambalu is just Kambalik. It just means Beijing. So if we come to the third chapter, the one before this, where it talks about Calix, you can see there are two mentions of a wall. However, those mentions of the wall, when Tamerlane had privately made mentions for preparations for an expedition that he'd promised his uncle, the uncle being the emperor, he had promised this expedition. So basically, Tamerlane says to his uncle that he's going to go and attack China. The king of this large country, who's named the offspring of the sun, expected no such matter. And you see, when talking of China, these lands are lying beyond a river called Tachi, and beyond that famous wall which bound both empires, and which the king of China built to secure himself and his people from the Tartarians. The next mention of the wall, nevertheless, he was willing that Calix should believe that he was passed beyond the mountains to assault the famous wall defended by all the armies of the Chineses. So it's saying Tamerlane wanted Calix to believe that he was already beyond the mountains and he was attacking the Chinese at the wall. So he's talking about the Chinese at the wall right here. If Calix was at Kambalu, which is the metropolis of the province of Cathay, if Calix is at Kambalu, how the hell is Kambalu also Peking? Because Tamerlane hasn't even gone there yet, and they talk about the wall. The only mentions of the wall, which is pretty easy to understand, right? So I hope I've explained it decently well, but just have a look. If this is Beijing, all right, and we're somewhere outside Beijing, and they're telling us that Beijing is Kambalu, it's the same place. So this Tartarian king is apparently living in Beijing in exactly the same place as the Emperor of China. No problems, they're not arguing or anything. They apparently both live in the same city and don't understand it. So Tamerlane wants to cross this wall to take over Beijing. And on the way to take over Beijing, somebody revolts. Now, history is trying to tell us that Beijing and Kambalu are the same place. So Kanbalik and Kambalu are the same place. That's what they're trying to say. So with that in mind, Tamerlane is on his way to attack Beijing when he gets a revolt, gets word that Calix has revolted and has taken Kambalu. So isn't that Beijing? So surely he's just heard that Calix has taken Kambalu. So he then goes and he goes, right, we're not attacking Beijing anymore. We're going to go and attack Kambalu, which is Beijing apparently. So then he goes and attacks Kambalu, beats Calix at Kambalu, which is Beijing. And then he leaves Beijing going, good job, lads. Now let's go attack Beijing. It doesn't make sense, does it? And then in the very next chapter, he mentions the wall 33 times because he's coming over the fucking wall. That's why he's mentioned it 33 times, because he's got to get over the wall. The page is dedicated to how they get round the wall. On page 60, it says, as he was nearest to the enemy, he had an opportunity to discover in what places the wall that stopped the Tartarian inroads might be assaulted. So on page 60, he's talking about what places on this wall he would be able to attack to get through. They found a local prince who took liking to them, and he betrayed the Chinese and divulged a secret passage that he knew that led into China. And it was easy to go in and surprise the soldiers that were guarding the wall. So again, why would he have to do this if he's already taken Kambalu? That doesn't make sense. None of that makes sense. So I've just spent quite a while on this because I need to hammer home that Kambalu and Beijing are not the same place. And this is obvious. This is obvious that they're not the same place. You'd have to be a moron to think they're the same place, because all the mentions of the wall are when he attacks Pekin. We saw him mention Pekin up here, Liutum and of Pekin. So why is he calling it Pekin if it's also Kambalu? Why is he confused? Why doesn't he realize that Calix is already at this place? Why doesn't he realize that he's had to cross a wall? Why is he worried about attacking the same wall if he's already crossed it so easily? He crossed it so easily, apparently he didn't even notice the first time. That doesn't make sense. So Kambalu and Khan Balik are two very different places. Khan Balik is Beijing, yes, as in Khan Balik. Kambalu, that's a different place entirely. On page 108, all things having been thus ordered, the army took the way to Kambalu. But before they began to march, the prince sent to the emperor, his uncle, to inform him of his happy successes and return. So he's returning to Kambalu. The army in their return homewards carried with them all their sick people, and after 2 days' march, they met with the new recruits that were coming to assist them. the prince ordered them to proceed on no further, but to return home towards Kambalu, whither he intended to go and meet with the emperor, who'd intended to see him there and give him a triumphing reception. So the emperor, who is Tamerlane's uncle, is meeting him at Kambalu. So, and he's saying, return home towards Kambalu. Go back, go to Kambalu. Don't worry, we're leaving China. We're going home. We're going to go see the emperor in Kambalu. So again, how can Kambalu and Peking be the same place? They're not. That's where history's lying. They've made a very big effort. I don't know who exactly, whether it was the Chinese, whether it was the Jesuits, the Russians, but they made a very big effort to lie about the location of Kambalu because it was definitely north of the Wall of China. Because if it was south of the Wall of China, then it wouldn't make sense. If Kambalu was south of the Wall of China, then Tamerlane never would have had to bother with getting over the wall. All of this stuff about the wall would be nonsense. It just wouldn't make sense. And there's many references to China being behind the wall to defend against the Tartarians. So why would Tartarians be behind the wall? None of that makes sense. So the document provided us some information, the 83rd to 180th degree longitude, 39 to 72 lat, and also 4,000, 2,000 miles going up and down. So we're going to have a look at that on Google Maps to plot that for you. So we get this box if we tap up the coordinates. As you can see here, this is, one of the coordinates there. The reason that's out in the ocean is because obviously north to south, they're trying to get every bit in. But they did a very good job when you consider 1690. They got this is the top one here. That will be the one in the ocean. This one here, down in the middle of the desert. And obviously it goes all the way up to the northern border. So these are the coordinates that were given in that book. And this is the area that it says is Tartary. It says that it's on the east of Russia. So obviously Russia over here, but this is where it does get a little bit confusing because Russia was owning big chunks of this at this point, and they were moving in this way. And as well, by 1690, the Russians had conquered all the way up to here. So 1690, the Russians had actually conquered all of this. So Tartaria and its exact location around about the time of this document is very debatable, because in 1689, we had the Treaty of Nechinsk, which saw Russia take all the land up to this border here, which was the Amur River, and they got everything on this side. And the Tatars, the Qing dynasty, they were in here. So that gives us more evidence that Kambalu was probably somewhere around here in the Manchuria area, or possibly around here somewhere, but definitely around here. Now, if we take the 4,000 miles it gave from Astrakhan, because Astrakhan was part of the Tartarian area. So this is Tartaria Minor in Ukraine. This is the original Tartarian areas around Kazan, because this is actually where you'll find the Republic of Tatarstan, also known as Tataria, right there. He was trying to take us over to the one in Romania. Yeah, that's another thing with the Tartarian tablets. Look at that another day. But you've got the Republic of Tatarstan. This area was officially known as Tataria, without the R, the Tataria. So from Astrakhan all the way up to the borders of Cathay, which is here, and we'll discuss Cathay as well briefly. Cathay is another thing that's been twisted. So Cathay, they'll tell you, is North China, and the Manji is South China. So as Wikipedia will tell us, Cathay is a historical name for China that was used in Europe during the early modern period. The term Cathay initially evolved as a term referring to what is now northern China, completely separate and distinct from China, which was a reference to southern China. So they try and say that it's North China and South China, but it's a little bit more than that. The Cathay region is the area beyond the Great Wall. So it's the area north of the Great Wall. Everywhere south of the Great Wall is the Manji. They're the Chinese. So, and well, there's a debate on Manji becoming Manchurians. So there is that. But Manji is the south of the wall, and Cathay is north. We'll have a look at some of the pictures, and you'll see. This one's interesting, by the way. I won't talk about it, but it's got Antichrist and Gog Magog here. It's flipped upside down, so this is north. But we'll have a look, for example, on, well, this map is a 1570 map. It's not a great one. China's down here. Cathay is here. So it's a little bit, that will be more north because obviously follow the curvature that is added on. So from China, that is actually north. Then you can see on this map, you've got a similar thing. This says Manji down here and the Cathay region up here. So we'll find one with a wall because the wall is, here we go. So that we can see up here, China is listed as China, and this is the Great Wall here following the mountains. And Cathay is north of the Great Wall. Now, this is important because we have Peking down south of the Great Wall. So Peking is right here. And up here is actually where we have Kambalu. So that's quite hard to see, but that's Kambalu up there. Poor image. I could get a better one up. I probably should do. Go on, just for you. There we go. So got a better quality version, and you can see the Great Wall right here. Though actually this one looks a little bit different. But yeah, so you've got the Great Wall right here. Peking would obviously be down here. And on the north of the Great Wall is where you'll find Kambalu and Kambalu River and stuff like that. I don't care. Thank you. Right. Kambalu would be there. It's definitely north of the Great Wall. And of course, that's how he describes it, because Tamerlane, he goes to Cathay where Kambalu is in Cathay, and then he has to go to China and he has to jump the wall. So evidently, Kambalu is north of the wall. Now, back to the document. It says it has remained unconquered under several governments until 1162. So we did read that. The imperial seat is at Shambalu. So yes, of course, is this talking about Kambalik in Beijing, or is it talking about somewhere north of the wall in Cathay? That's for you to decide, but hopefully I've convinced you. The inhabitants are Mohammedans, pagans, some Christians, and the Nestorian sect. And it also talks about the language. So the language is the Tartarian language, very boisterous and clamorous, almost the same with the Turkish, having some mixture of Persian and Scythian words. In some places, they use the Persian tongue. Now, that talks about their chief commodities, what they sell, and it also breaks up Tartaria into 5 great parts. Tataria Deserta, which is the most western province bordering on Russia, and it's divided into the Kalmuki butchers or the Olgarians, the Chazag or the Kashgars, and the Karakathays or the Shamshalites. And the 2 main cities or the capital cities are Sharkan and Kumbalik. So, or it does say the capital city of the whole, or the main city of the whole, is Sharkan or Karkan, however you want to say that. So you've got Karkan and Kumbalik. Notice how that is very similar to Kambalu. It's probably the same meaning. Kumbalik, Kanbalik, city of the Sham or city of the Khan. So it does seem that this name is something that moves around as well. Because obviously, if you've just set up a new kingdom and you build a new city, you say, this is my city, the city of me, city of the Sham. So Kumbalik, Kanbalik, Kambalu. So yeah, the second part is Uzbek or Zagathay on the south of Tartaria Deserta. It's about 1,200 miles long, and it contains the old provinces of Sake, Sogdania, and parts of Scythia and Old Persia. So this is the bit that, as we know, was called Independent Tartary for a while, until the Russians finally invaded that. The capital cities are Samarkand, which is where Tamerlane is supposedly from, Bukhara, and Istigius, which I've never heard of that one. It's probably got a different name, which I have heard of. There's also the provinces of Belch, Alfoyd, or Alsoid, Khwarazm, Al-Shah, and Targana. The third part of Tartaria is Turkestan, which is part of ancient Scythia, and it's on the east of Zagathay, about 1,400 miles long. The capital cities or capital towns are Tibet, Kaskar, and Khotan. It contains many kingdoms as Kaskar, Chialis or Turfan, Chiatium, Khotam, Tibet, Kamul, Lop, Tainsu, Taindu, and others. The Lop, of course, can be located today, the Lop Desert, so there would have been the kingdom of Lop in the Lop Desert. So that does give you an idea that these are the right places. Turkestan on the east of independent Tartary. Tartaria Deserta, as it's known, is north of that. So it's very interesting that they call that the desert, considering I would argue that the Lop is the desert. But now the 4th section is called Mongol or Magog, the true old Tartary. It's on the north of Turkestan, about 1,800 miles long and 950 in breadth. The chief towns are Mongol and Tenduk. It contains many provinces as Sumogul or Tartar, Tenduk or Mekrat, Baju or Mekrit, Tekmogul, Kali, and others. So Mongol or Magog is north of Turkestan, which does seem to match with Mongolia and areas to the east. And then finally, we have Cathay or Kin Tartary on the southeast of Mongol, about 1,650 miles long and 1,100 miles in breadth. It contains 4 great provinces, Cathay or Nayman, Kambalu or Arab Kambalik, Nish or Tenduk, and Yupi. It contains the ancient Sarika and parts of Scythia. I'll bring us back to another map because on Wikipedia, they're obviously talking about how Cathay is China, is exactly the same as China. But anyway, so you can kind of sense the passive aggressiveness with the Cathay is finally gone. This 1689 map by Giacomo Cantelli da Vignola from Modena identifies it and Manji with China. So now if we zoom in on this, we can see Peking and Liaotung. So those are the places that were mentioned as where Tamerlane was about to go and invade, until he got word that Calix, one of the kings of Tartary, had decided to take over Kambalu. Now, Kambalu isn't shown on this map, but it's usually shown as being either near the Sungari or Quentung Fluvius. So it's still in this region. So even though Cathay has gone, it's still here. It's not China. It's still south of the wall. I mean, it became China, as in they invaded China. So it's one of these things where it's a confusion, but they've also purposely tried to do it. Now you'll notice over here is the Yupi that was just mentioned, the Tartary de Yupi. So we just heard about the Yupi people, and they're over here on the right. So this is the Chinese south of this wall. We can have a look at this picture. This picture from just before, which shows us Cathay up here, Kambalu right here on this river, which is called the River Pulisanja on this map. So we can see that Kambalu is right here, and it's outside the wall, a wall of 400 leagues betwixt the banks of hills, built by the kings of China against the breakings in of the Tartars, kingdom of the Great Sham, and it's north of the walls. Cathay is north of the walls, it's northeast. So it's very easy to work out once you realize that. And you can see the mountains of the greatest note are those anciently called Imao, dividing Tartary in the middle. The rivers of principal note are 4, the Obi, which we know about the Obi because that's in Russia, Okanda, Chesil, or the Jaxartis, which is located in independent Tartary, and Polisanya, which is the one we just saw located northeast of China in Cathay. And there's the most considerable lakes are 4. We've got Kithay, Kithaska, Koras, and Amu. These are all very difficult to locate today. Some very interesting things have happened there. So I hope you've enjoyed going through this document. Like I said, when I check the other things, there are a load of documents that include the same kind of info or similar kind of info. So it's just a tedious process to go through all of these and find all the things that you need to really build a picture. It's evident from what we've seen that obviously China here, this isn't Cathay. Maybe this was Manji. But this is Cathay. This is Cathay here. Over here are the Yupi people. This is where you find the Yupis, which makes sense with the map that we found. And if we have a look at Yupi Tartars, they're known as the Nanai people. And they lived along the Amur River. And they were actually evacuated by the Chinese originally. So the Amur River is, of course, this one that we saw over here. This makes this border. So this river here comes from up there, down there, around there. So these people are from here. And on this map, I've got from Rare Maps, the date on this, it's from Stockholm, London, 1730. So the reason we come to this one, obviously we can see down here the Great Wall of China peaking there. And if we come up, we can see our Amur River. Now it does have a different flow. It comes right from the side instead of coming from up. So that could just be a mapping issue there. Or maybe it did actually flow a bit differently a few hundred years ago. But we can see Yupi Tartaros down here. So that matches that map that we just saw, which is up here, Tartary to Yupi The UP is around this corner. Cathay is right here, just beyond this wall. So have a look at the wall. Cathay, the UPs are going to be up here. So having a look at this here, again, we've got the Great Wall of China around here, the UPs around here. So where do we think Cathay is going to be? Around here somewhere, isn't it? This will be the Cathay region. So we can assume that Kambalu, the proper Kambalu, not Kambalik, proper Kambalu is around here somewhere, with a Christian kingdom till for only 60 years. Supposedly set up by Prester John, or maybe even Didymus Thomas himself, although I think if it was Didymus Thomas, it'd be about 1200 years late because he was supposed to be around at the same time as Jesus. But very interesting. I mean, it might have taken him 1200 years to walk all the way from Jerusalem. It's a bit of a distance. So I think we'll call that one the end of that. I hope you've enjoyed watching and learning. Hope you learned a lot from that book. Hope you've learned about Cathay and Kambalu, and you can join us on the hunt for these places where they really were, because there is a lot of confusion. I mean, who knows, maybe these places really were south of the wall, but I think when you look at the books talking about how Kambalu is evidently a separate place, the voyages and shipping of the Mongol Tatars and settlements on the western coast of America. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to come back